In the final hours before his death, Che Guevara was no longer moving between uncertainty and possibility. His situation was defined. He was wounded, captured, and fully aware that events had narrowed to a single outcome. What remains unclear in many accounts is that he was not completely isolated during this period. There was a conversation. It did not take place in a formal setting. There were no witnesses taking notes, no official record created at the time. The exchange was brief, controlled, and deliberately understated. This was not an interrogation and not a negotiation. It was a moment that occurred after decisions had already been made. The identity of the person who spoke to Che has been described differently across sources. Some accounts refer to a soldier, others to an officer or intermediary. What is consistent is that this person was not acting independently. He was positioned within a structure that had already accepted what would follow. The conversation did not exist to change the outcome. This distinction is essential. Conversations that precede intervention tend to carry urgency. They involve delay, bargaining, or uncertainty. This exchange did not. According to later testimony, the tone was calm and procedural. Che was spoken to not as a bargaining figure, but as a prisoner whose fate was already settled. What was said has never been fully documented. Later recollections emphasize the absence of ideology. Che did not use the moment to argue for his cause, and he did not appeal to international pressure or revolutionary solidarity. This absence mirrors patterns seen elsewhere in his final days. By this point, Che no longer expected intervention. The conversation instead reflected recognition. Che acknowledged the position of the person speaking to him, and the person speaking acknowledged Che's awareness of what was coming. This mutual recognition removed the need for confrontation. There was no attempt to persuade or resist. The exchange existed within limits both sides understood. Importantly, the conversation did not result in any change of procedure. No messages were sent afterward. No delays were introduced. No new channels were opened. The system continued uninterrupted. This confirms that the exchange was not intended to disrupt decision-making, but to complete a process already underway. What makes this moment significant is not its content, but its placement in time. It occurred after capture but before execution. In that narrow window, alternative actions were theoretically possible. Yet the conversation did not activate them. This reinforces the conclusion that inaction was already the chosen path. The person who spoke to Che later described the exchange as restrained. There was no hostility. There was also no sympathy expressed in a way that suggested resistance. The interaction functioned as an acknowledgment rather than a challenge. Both parties understood the boundaries of what could be said and what could not. This moment complicates simplified narratives. Che was neither defiant nor pleading. He was not silent, but he was not negotiating. The person who spoke to him was neither savior nor executioner. He was an intermediary in a process that no longer required justification. The fact that this conversation remained largely unspoken for decades is consistent with its nature. Speaking about it would not have revealed new facts. It would have revealed alignment. Silence preserved the impression that events unfolded without human interaction, when in reality they unfolded with quiet acceptance. This is why the last conversation matters. It shows that Che's final hours were not defined by chaos or confusion, but by clarity. Words were exchanged, but they did not alter direction. They confirmed it. In the next part, we will examine who this person was, why he later chose to speak about the encounter, and what the delayed testimony reveals about the structure that surrounded Che's final moments. The person who spoke to Che Guevara in those final hours did not come forward immediately. For years, his role remained unclear, fragmented across indirect references and partial testimonies. This was not because his identity was unknown, but because speaking about the encounter served no immediate purpose within the structure that followed. Accounts that later emerged described this individual as someone positioned close enough to Che to observe his condition, but not powerful enough to influence decisions. He was not a senior official shaping policy, nor a distant observer removed from responsibility. He occupied an intermediate position, close to the event, yet bound by the limits of his role. This position explains both the conversation itself and the silence that followed it. The individual had access but not authority. He could speak but not decide. The conversation occurred because proximity allowed it. It ended without consequence because authority did not. The delay in speaking publicly about the encounter was not driven by fear alone. It was driven by context. Immediately after Che's death, the environment did not allow for nuance. The narrative required simplicity. Che was presented as a defeated insurgent. The event was framed as a closed chapter. Any account that introduced complexity would have disrupted that closure. The individual understood this. He recognized that his testimony would not change what had happened, but it would complicate how it was understood. Complication carried risk. Silence carried stability. Over time, silence became habit. As years passed, the moment receded into memory. The individual aged alongside a history that no longer needed his perspective. Speaking later would not restore urgency. It would only introduce questions that had already been settled publicly. What eventually altered this calculation was distance. Political conditions shifted. Authority structures changed. The urgency that once demanded silence weakened. The individual began to recognize that his silence no longer protected anything. It merely preserved an incomplete account. When he finally spoke, his testimony was restrained. He did not dramatize the encounter. He did not claim significance beyond what he observed. He emphasized how ordinary the exchange felt. This ordinariness is precisely what makes it revealing. According to his account, Che did not ask for intervention. He did not attempt to negotiate. He did not appeal to ideology or history. The conversation acknowledged reality rather than resisted it. This acknowledgment confirmed what the structure had already decided. The individual also emphasized what did not happen after the conversation. There were no instructions to relay messages. No attempt to contact higher authority. No signal that procedures should change. The conversation closed without ripple. This absence of consequence reinforces the idea that the exchange was not a missed opportunity. It was a confirmation. Che understood the limits of the moment, and so did the person speaking to him. Both operated within boundaries already defined. The delayed testimony does not transform the conversation into something more dramatic than it was. It clarifies its function. The exchange was not about saving Che. It was about recognizing that nothing would be done. This recognition explains why the testimony remained quiet for so long. It did not expose wrongdoing in the conventional sense. It exposed alignment. Speaking earlier would have forced acknowledgement that silence was not accidental. It was consistent. By waiting decades to speak, the individual allowed the narrative to settle before adding texture. His testimony does not overturn history. It deepens it. It shows how moments that appear empty are often full of understanding. In the next part, we will examine what was said in the conversation itself, how its content reflects acceptance rather than resistance, and why the words exchanged mattered precisely because they changed nothing. The content of the conversation with Che Guevara has never been recorded verbatim. There is no transcript, no official report, and no contemporaneous documentation. What exists are later recollections, carefully framed, restrained, and consistent in what they exclude. According to the individual who later spoke about the encounter, the conversation did not revolve around ideology. Che did not attempt to restate his beliefs, defend his actions, or justify his presence in Bolivia. By that point, arguments had lost relevance. The outcome was no longer subject to persuasion. Instead, the exchange focused on recognition of circumstance. Che acknowledged his condition and the authority of the system holding him. The person speaking to him acknowledged Che's awareness of what was coming. This mutual recognition removed the need for confrontation. There was no tension because there was no expectation of change. One of the most striking elements of the account is the absence of request. Che did not ask for time. He did not ask for messages to be delivered. He did not ask for intervention. This absence is not explained by resignation alone. It reflects an understanding that requests would not be acted upon. The individual described Che's tone as controlled and precise. There was no attempt to dramatize the moment. The conversation was brief and bounded. It did not expand beyond what both parties already knew. This brevity is important. Extended conversation often signals uncertainty. This exchange did not. The words that were spoken were described as practical rather than emotional. Che addressed the situation directly, without invoking history or legacy. He did not attempt to frame the moment for future interpretation. He spoke as someone closing a process, not opening one. Equally important is what the other party did not say. There were no assurances, no expressions of doubt, and no indication that procedures might change. The person speaking to Che did not imply that higher authority could intervene. Silence on that point was deliberate. To suggest possibility where none existed would have been misleading. This restraint reflects the broader structure surrounding the event. The conversation did not occur in isolation. It took place within a system that had already defined the limits of action. Both participants understood those limits and did not test them. The individual later emphasized that the conversation did not feel historic at the time. Felt routine. This ordinariness is revealing. Moments that change outcomes tend to feel charged. Moments that confirm outcomes tend to feel flat. This one was the latter. By the time the conversation ended, nothing had shifted. The procedures remained intact. The timeline remained unchanged. The exchange functioned as a final acknowledgment rather than an intervention point. This understanding reframes the idea of last words. The significance of the conversation lies not in dramatic statements, but in the absence of them. Che's final exchange did not attempt to alter his fate. It accepted it. This acceptance does not imply passivity. It implies clarity. Che recognized that the window for action had closed before the conversation began. Speaking did not reopen it. The later testimony about this exchange is careful because it must be. Revealing the content too vividly would risk suggesting that something could have been done. The restraint in recounting mirrors the restraint in the moment itself. What was said matters because it shows that Che's final hours were not marked by confusion or desperation. They were marked by understanding. Words were exchanged, but they did not seek rescue. They acknowledged finality. In the final part, we will examine why this conversation remained marginal in historical accounts, how its quiet nature allowed it to be absorbed into silence, and what it ultimately reveals about how endings are managed within systems of power. The final conversation with Che Guevara did not vanish because it was insignificant. It disappeared because it did not serve the narrative that followed. History often preserves moments that explain action. This conversation explained inaction. After Che's death, accounts focused on outcomes rather than process. The story moved quickly from capture to execution, from presence to absence. In that transition, there was little space for a quiet exchange that changed nothing. The conversation did not advance ideology, reveal strategy, or justify decisions. It simply confirmed that the outcome had already been accepted. For institutions involved, acknowledging the conversation would have introduced an uncomfortable implication. That Che was fully aware, and that those around him were equally aware, yet nothing was done. This awareness would have shifted responsibility away from circumstance and toward structure. Silence avoided that shift. As years passed, the absence of this conversation from official histories became self-reinforcing. New accounts relied on earlier ones. Each repetition solidified a version of events that left no room for human interaction in the final hours. The moment was not denied. It was ignored. Those who knew about the exchange understood why. Speaking about it would not have exposed cruelty or betrayal in a simple sense. It would have exposed alignment. It would have shown how systems conclude chapters not through dramatic confrontation, but through quiet confirmation. The individual who eventually spoke about the conversation did so with restraint. He did not present himself as a witness to something transformative. He emphasized how ordinary the exchange felt. This ordinariness is precisely why it matters. It shows how endings are often managed without urgency, emotion, or debate. What the conversation ultimately reveals is not a secret message or hidden plea. It reveals clarity. Che understood that intervention was no longer expected. Those around him understood that intervention was no longer planned. Words were exchanged within those boundaries. This understanding reframes Che's final hours. They were not marked by chaos or last-minute uncertainty. They were marked by closure. The conversation did not attempt to reopen possibilities. It acknowledged that possibilities had already closed. That is why the conversation remained marginal for so long. It did not fit heroic narratives or tragic misunderstandings. It fit a quieter truth, that decisions had already been made elsewhere, and that silence was the final mechanism through which they were carried out. By examining this last exchange, we do not change what happened. We change how it is understood. The end of Che Guevara's life was not defined only by who acted, but by who did not, and by the shared understanding that nothing more would be done. History often remembers the loudest moments. This story reminds us that some of the most consequential moments pass quietly, acknowledged only by those present, and preserved only when someone later decides that silence no longer explains enough.